Can you imagine discovering that your car could be one of the most revolutionary in Formula One? And at the same time being afraid to take it to the limit in the first race of the year? That is exactly what Aston Martin is experiencing after the Bahrain 2026 tests. Because while the AMR 26 has left several paddock engineers whispering about an impossible-to-copy concept, the reality is that neither Fernando Alonso nor Lance Stroll were able to complete full race simulations. Vibrations in the V6, problems in the hybrid system, limited power, and a car that barely showed its true performance. But here comes the most shocking thing. If the improvements that Aston Martin is preparing for the Australian GP work, we could be facing the birth of the most radical car in the new regulations. The question is clear. Will we see in Melbourne a masterpiece hidden in Bahrain, or the beginning of a season marked by fragility? Aston Martin arrived at the Bahrain 2026 tests with a very clear narrative. The AMR 26 was not a timid evolution, it was a declaration of intentions. New regulations, new philosophy, and a total integration with Honda that should mark the beginning of a completely different stage for the team. But what happened at the Sakir circuit completely changed the tone of the project before the season even began. From day one, the testing program began to fall apart. It was not a simple minor setback, it was an accumulation of problems that prevented the completion of long runs and left the team far from the planned plan. Reliability became the great enemy. The car barely ran long enough to validate basic settings, and every race simulation attempt ended prematurely. The core of the problem was not in the aerodynamics, nor in the mechanical balance, nor even in the setup. It was at the heart of the project, the Honda 2026 power unit. The abnormal vibrations of the V6 began to generate a domino effect that directly affected the hybrid system, especially the battery pack integrated into the monocoque. In one of the most important simulations, Fernando Alonso had to stop his run after just 23 laps due to a failure resulting from this situation. That was not a simple preventive cut, it was a structural warning sign. The last day was even more worrying. Lance Stroll was barely able to complete 6 timed laps due to a lack of spare parts available. That means that Aston Martin was not only managing a technical problem, it was also managing limited resources in the middle of an official test. The fact that summarizes everything is devastating. The longest stint without going through the pits was approximately 14 laps. In a context where other teams were already working on complete Grand Prix simulations, Aston Martin could not even validate the car's behavior with high fuel and real degradation. As a direct consequence, Honda was forced to limit effective power and electrical deployment for much of the test. This means that the AMR 26 rolled capped, without showing its true potential on the straight or in acceleration. The times, therefore, do not necessarily reflect the actual performance of the car, but rather a contained version designed to survive. And this is where the contradiction that left Alonso and Stroll stunned appears. Because, despite the operational chaos, the sensations in certain fast sectors and in aerodynamic stability were promising. The car transmitted something different. There was potential. But that potential was locked behind a hybrid system that could not yet be exploited normally. If Bahrain showed the fragility of the project, it also hinted at something much more disturbing for the rest of the grid. The AMR 26 could be one of the most conceptually advanced cars in the new 2026 regulations. Because while the spotlight was focused on the lack of laps and reliability problems, within the paddock there began to be whispered about another much more important detail. Aston Martin's aerodynamic concept is radical. Extremely radical. The first images of the shakedown already hinted at a different philosophy. An exaggerated side pod undercut, almost defiant in the face of the new chassis width restrictions. Cooling intakes minimized to the limit, a sign of extremely aggressive packaging of the Honda power unit. This is no coincidence. When you reduce the air intake so much, you are betting everything on millimetric thermal efficiency and perfect integration between engine and chassis. But the most shocking thing is under the car. The floor and diffuser package has been described as one of the most elaborate on the grille, designed to generate load with minimal resistance. Some independent analyses even talk about a monster aero package, prepared specifically for Melbourne, something that, if the correlation between wind tunnel and CFD is correct, could be extremely difficult for rivals to copy. And this is where everything starts to come together. The new 2026 regulation reduces absolute dependence on the traditional ground effect and increases the weight of the balance between load and energy efficiency. Aston Martin seems to have understood this better than many. They have opted for a car that not only generates support, but does so with a very controlled sensitivity in height changes and dynamic rake. The decision to implement a double pushrod architecture in both the front and rear axle is not a simple technical detail. It is a declaration of intent. This configuration allows much more precise control of the car's heights, optimizing the flow towards the diffuser and stabilizing the aerodynamic platform in critical phases of braking and acceleration. In other words, the AMR26 is not designed to be stable by default. It is designed to be extremely efficient when everything is running in its optimal window. And that explains why Alonso and Stroll were surprised. Because in the few clean laps they were able to complete, the car showed a very solid aerodynamic foundation. Stability in fast cornering, support when changing direction, and load feel were promising. But that promise was constantly interrupted by the need to limit power and manage reliability. Here is the great irony of the project. Aerodynamically, it can be one of the most intelligent cars of the new regulatory cycle, but it depends on a hybrid unit that still does not allow it to exploit that potential. Aston Martin has not built a conservative car for 2026. It has built a car to the limit. Everything that happened in Bahrain makes the 2026 Australian Grand Prix more than just the first race on the calendar. For Aston Martin, Melbourne is not simply the start of the season. It is a technical exam under maximum pressure. Because the team arrives with a brutal paradox, one of the most promising aerodynamic concepts of the new regulations, and a power unit that has not yet proven to be able to sustain a full race distance. After the tests, Honda was forced to limit the effective power and aggressiveness of the electrical deployment to protect the hybrid system. This means that the AMR26 ran below its true potential. And the most delicate thing is that the 2026 engine is already approved by the FIA, which restricts any hardware modification except in very specific cases justified by reliability. In other words, the margin of reaction is minimal. So Australia won't just be a matter of pure speed. It will be a management issue. Aston Martin will have to decide to what extent it unleashes the car's potential. If you risk and allow a more aggressive energy display to try to surprise from the start, or if you keep the engine capped to guarantee that both cars cross the finish line. And this is where improvements play a key role. The aerodynamic package prepared for Melbourne is designed to maximize efficiency on a semi-urban circuit like Albert Park, where traction, braking stability, and straight-line speed are decisive. If the balance between load and resistance works as the internal data suggests, the AMR26 could be extremely competitive in fast sectors. But if the hybrid system shows weaknesses again, all that aerodynamic work will be neutralized. For Fernando Alonso, this represents a complex situation. He knows how to identify when a car has a championship base, and the aerodynamic sensations point to something special. But he also understands that in modern Formula One it is not enough to have charge and efficiency. You need energy stability, electrical reliability, and complete confidence in the hybrid deployment. For Lance Stroll, the scenario is similar. The few competitive laps reveal the car with real potential, but the lack of knowledge about its resistance at full distance generates an uncertainty that is impossible to ignore. Australia will therefore be an experiment in real time. If Aston Martin manages to complete the weekend without severe restrictions and the hybrid system responds under pressure, the AMR26 could reveal a speed that remained hidden in Bahrain. And that would completely change the narrative of the start of 2026. But if the fragility persists, the season could begin with defensive management, sacrificing performance for survival. And in a new regulation where each race marks the direction of development, starting on the defensive can cost much more than just a few points. Aston Martin arrives at the 2026 Australian Grand Prix in a position that very few teams have experienced at the start of a new regulation, having a potentially brilliant car on their hands, but still incomplete. The Bahrain tests did not reflect the true level of AMR26. The limitations in the hybrid system, the vibrations of the V6, and the need to reduce power prevented the car from showing its real performance. However, behind that layer of compromised reliability lies an extremely ambitious aerodynamic concept, designed to exploit every millimeter of the new regulations. That is the duality that has left Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll stunned. You are not looking at a mediocre car. They are looking at a car with a very high technical ceiling, but it has not yet proven to be able to sustain it over a full race distance. Australia will be the first big filter. If the improvements manage to stabilize the power unit and release part of the energy potential, the AMR26 can surprise from the first appointment on the calendar. But if fragility persists, Aston Martin will be forced to manage, protect, and contain rather than attack. And in a year of regulatory change, whoever strikes first usually sets the direction of development for the rest of the season. The story of the AMR26 does not really begin in Bahrain. Start in Melbourne. There we will know if Aston Martin has created the car that can redefine the 2026 cycle, or if its technical ambition will need more time to become a reality. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.